The eastern Washington plains stretched out like a vast, empty ocean, their silence broken only by the low hum of autonomous machines. The wheat still grew tall here, golden waves swaying beneath the pale sky. But the farmhouses that once dotted the horizon stood like hollow shells, roofs sagged, windows shattered, and paint peeled away in strips that fluttered with the wind. The barns were empty, their timbers were collapsing under decades of neglect. It was not that the land was abandoned. On the contrary, it had never been more productive. Drones swept low across the fields, spraying precise doses of nutrients and pesticides. Self-driving combines rolled endlessly, harvesting grain with machine precision, and unloading their bounty into autonomous trucks that drove it straight to high-speed rail lines. Yields per acre were higher than ever, and water was used more efficiently, and disease outbreaks were curbed before they ever even began. But the people were gone. The exodus began in the 2030s. For years before that, farmers had already been struggling under the weight of taxes, debt, and collapsing commodity prices. Younger generations wanted nothing to do with the land. They fled to cities or to virtual jobs online. Baby boomers who had inherited family farms sold them off, either piecemeal or in desperate auctions. Corporate agribusiness and global investment funds swooped in, buying entire counties at pennies on the dollar. At first, nothing looked different. Some families still stayed in their homes, now as tenants rather than owners. But when taxes climbed and services withered, schools closing, clinics shutting down, roads left to crumble, people had little choice. By 2040, many counties had fewer residents than they had in the 1890s, and some towns disappeared entirely, their main streets boarded up, their names only remembered in the digital archives. The corporations didn't mind. In fact, they preferred this. Humans were messy, unpredictable, and expensive to serve. The machines did not complain about road maintenance or demand schools. Machines needed only power, spare parts, and algorithms. To corporate boards, the human element was the inefficiency. Not everyone left, as pockets of resistance clung to the land. These were families who refused to sell, who had too much pride in their homesteads, or who simply had nowhere else to go. They lived in crumbling houses, surrounded by miles of corporate farmland. Their lives a constant negotiation with the machines. Children grew up without schools, learning piecemeal from old books or pirated internet connections. And medical care was also scarce. When the roads cracked or the bridges collapsed, the corporations had no incentive to repair them unless they directly served the routes for grain and export. Isolation deepened. Some who stayed turned bitter, forming loosely organized militias that blamed the outsiders, the city people, the corporations, and even the government for their decline. They vandalized machines, stole grain, and occasionally attacked corporate infrastructure. In response, the corporation deployed private security drones, silent guardians that hovered at the edges of abandoned farmhouses. It became a game of cat and mouse. Desperate people against cold, unblinking machines. Most of the displaced ended up in what was known as containment cities. These were sprawling megacities along the coasts and major river valleys, where populations were herded as the rural economies collapsed. At first, governments promised opportunity, retraining, and affordable housing. But as automation continued to gut service and industrial jobs, the opportunities evaporated. By the 2040s, containment cities were overcrowded, underfunded, and heavily policed. Universal basic income, promised decades earlier, had been implemented in a skeletal form. It was just enough to prevent mass starvation, but not enough to provide real dignity or choice. Millions lived in high-rise capsules, dependent on government credits and corporate-controlled supply chains for food, medicine, and digital entertainment. To keep the peace, governments leaned heavily on surveillance and predictive policing. AI tracked purchases, communications, and movements. People who challenged the system found themselves flagged as destabilizing agents and cut off from credits. A life outside the containment cities was possible, but only at the margins, often in outlaw communities eking out survival in abandoned rural zones. Eastern Washington in 2050. Driving east from Spokane, the change was stark. The city had grown into one of the containment hubs, its skyline bristling with drone towers and corporate offices. But beyond the outer ring, the countryside was eerily empty. Once thriving towns like Colfax and Oakdale were husks. Schools had collapsed into ruins, their playgrounds overgrown with weeds. Cemeteries were the only places still tended, often by local volunteers or descendants who returned briefly to bury their dead. The highways were maintained only in segments that served corporate needs. A self-driving grain hauler might glide smoothly over freshly paved asphalt for 30 miles, only to divert into a private company road while the old state highway crumbled into potholes and weeds. For ordinary humans, traveling these roads were perilous. Farmhouses like the one you saw for sale were everywhere. Massive, beautiful structures from the early 20th century, built by prosperous families in an age before mechanized abandonment. Now they sold for pennies, $100,000, sometimes less, but with $8,000 to $10,000 in taxes and no local services, they were traps. Corporations often bought them simply to let them rot, waiting for the county to condemn them so the land could be cleared for machine staging grounds. On summer nights, the silence was oppressive. The sounds of human life, children playing, dogs barking, tractors rumbling, voices drifting across the fields, were all gone. Instead, there was only the mechanical hum of drones and the whisper of wheat in the wind. For some, this was peace. For others, it was despair. The land that had once drawn homesteaders with promises of opportunity was now a stage for corporate efficiency. The dream of independence and family farming had died. It got replaced by silent productivity for distant markets. Eastern Washington was only one piece of a larger story. Across the world, similar patterns emerged. In the American Midwest, entire counties were depopulated. In Brazil, the Amazon had been carved into vast corporate plantations. In Africa, land grabs concentrated ownership in the hands of multinationals, pushing millions into precarious megacities. Billions of people were simply no longer needed by the global economy. Some survived in containment cities. Others drifted through outlaw zones, scraping by in barter economies. A small minority, the wealthy, the skilled elites, the corporate managers, lived in fortified enclaves with clean air, reliable health care, and abundant leisure. The cruelest cut of all was not just economic, but spiritual. People asked, if the system doesn't need us, why are we even here? Without meaningful work, many spiraled into depression, and substance abuse became rampant in containment cities. The suicide rates soared. Governments responded by flooding the population with digital distractions, immersive VR entertainment, endless streams of content designed to pacify. It worked for some, but others rejected it, forming underground networks that sought to rebuild human purpose outside of the system. In eastern Washington, some of these networks reclaimed abandoned houses, not for farming, but for community experiments. Collectives that lived with minimal tech, growing just enough food to survive. They were hunted by corporate drones, but they multiplied like weeds, reminders that human resilience could not be fully erased. By the year 2050, the silent fields of eastern Washington told a story. Progress without people is a kind of death. The wheat grew, the machines hummed, the exports flowed, but the land, stripped of laughter, stories, and struggle, felt haunted. The Homestead Act that had once brought people here with the promise of belonging, now the system had pushed them out, having no further use for their hands or hearts. The silent field stood as both a triumph of efficiency and a tragedy of meaning. The future had proven that the system no longer needed people on the land, but it had not yet answered the question of what to do with all the people left behind.